Okay, we're recording now.
So I'm going to put 3 book titles in the chat that we were discussing earlier before everyone came in. And I'll put them up again at the end, but I wanted to get them in there before I forget. So there's 3 texts there. And then the other thing I'm going to put in the chat is, and I'll do this again at the end, but I just want to make sure they're in there. The other thing is a direct link to a class with Bexley Seabury that the church does, the diocese, nationally, about exploring the doctrine of discovery and the impacts on the Episcopal Church. And they're in the middle of a session right now, but if you scroll down that page, you'll see that there's a fall session starting in September. And I already did it once last year, and I'm going to do it again because it was so full of such good information. So I'm going to do it again next fall. So I'd love to invite all of you to join me in that. It's a nominal fee of like $50. And you can also support an Indigenous scholar through that link as well. So it's really delightful. Assuming there's not a lot of people left in the waiting room, we are going to get started. So I wanted to welcome all of you to the first of our Lenten series chats about truth and reconciliation and racial justice. I'm so excited that Simon came to me and said, I really think it's important for us to talk about this as a congregation. And I am thrilled to be doing it. So I wanted to do just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions for Gail as she is speaking, please just put them in the chat. So we're going to keep everybody muted. And I'm actually going to let Gail explain the storytelling tradition she's coming from so that you understand why. And so you'll all be muted, but if you have questions, just put them in the chat. And then when she's done with her presentation, I will go through the questions and we'll facilitate a dialogue with Gail at the end. So if you'll all stay muted, that would be great. The other thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to open us up with a quick prayer before I introduce Gail, just because, you know, it's church, so why not? If you will just take a moment with me, I'm going to open with a poem that is, and I want you to imagine that we are entering into this Lenten season and we are awakening. And so I want you to imagine that we are coming into this with an open heart and open mind. And this poem is called What to Remember When Waking, and it's by David White. In that first hardly noticed moment in which you wake, coming back to this life from the other, more secret, movable, and frighteningly honest world where everything began, there is a small opening into the new day, which closes the moment you begin your plans. What you can plan is too small for you to live. What you can live wholeheartedly will make plans enough for the vitality hidden in your sleep. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. To remember the other world in this world is to live in your true inheritance. You are not a troubled guest on this earth. You are not an accident amidst other accidents. You were invited from another and greater night than the one from which you have just emerged. Now looking through the slanting light of the morning window toward the mountain presence of everything that can be, what urgency calls you to your one love? What shape awaits in the seed of you to grow and spread its branches against a future sky? Is it waiting in the fertile sea, in the trees beyond the house, in the life you can't imagine for yourself, in the open and lovely white page on the writing desk? Amen. So I am super excited to introduce to you my amazing, beautiful, wonderful friend, Gail. Gail is a PhD candidate at Oregon State University in the College of Agriculture, Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation. Her focus is based on elk movement and subsistence gathering. She teaches difference, power, and discrimination classes, introducing ways to break down the bonds of settler colonist ideologies in science. And her classes shape worldview in Indigenous natural resource management. She's a graduate of the Difference, Power, and Discrimination Leadership Academy and an advocate for underrepresented people. She is also one of my dearest and most amazing friends, and I'm so honored that she is here with us tonight. So remember, if you have questions, just type them into the chat. And Gail, I will leave it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really nice to see everyone here tonight. I'm really honored to be here. Before I begin, I would like to thank Father Simon and Dr. Melissa Bird, as well as the Church of Good Samaritan, inclusive, traditional, and progressive church members and congregational people who are gathering under its eaves. I think it's wonderful that we are able to have this conversation. I tried to place the information that I'm going to tell you tonight or talk with you about tonight in a timeline in kind of a way, but you have to remember that during the things that we do discuss, there's about 87,000 other things that I could be talking about that goes along with that, which would take us about 365 days to complete this discussion. And I know that we all have things to do. My ancestral heritage is Northern Cheyenne, Jicarilla, Apache, and also Muskogee Creek. I'm state enrolled, Southern Muskogee Creek, and they used to call us Trotter Indians because we ran between the borders of Georgia and Florida back in the day when we were being removed or placed into slavery. My family names are Morgan, Tsakataha, Lane, Kingfisher, relatives, Woodside, and Hunt. I do have a grandfather who, his mother was from the country of Georgia, and they left that country back in the turn of the century to gain freedom from war. They moved through Germany and then came over to the United States. Today we're going to be presenting things in what we call an oral tradition, which is why when a person is talking, you let them speak, and then when they are finished, then we have discussions. And so that is why we're asking you to send your questions to Melissa in the chat, and we will talk about those things later. It's important that we talk about these hard conversations because we were all raised, a lot of us in the country here, with a lack of knowledge about what happened in the early days of colonization of this country, or the information wasn't accurate. And a lot of people have a lot of knowledge and some don't. So we're just going to all be in here together in the same classroom discussing things. I'm excited that I'm sitting here with so many beautiful souls that are looking back at me. It's been a real challenge to be able to figure out ways to meet with each other during this hard time of transition that we're going through with the earth and the pandemic. And now we're looking at the possibility of war, which is very difficult for all of us to cope with, including our youth. But you know, that it's interesting when we start this discussion, how what is happening in the world today is so connected to what we're going to discuss tonight, because we're talking about a democratic country, Ukraine, who is being invaded by basically a dictator, and people once again are on the move, right? Even Christ's parents were leaving to go pay taxes and were all of the stories from the Bible talk about being removed and having to relocate other places. So with that said, some of the topics we'll be touching on tonight will be based on doctrine of discovery, just wars, what that really means, chosen one philosophy, manifest destiny, and the Marshall trilogy. And the reason why we're starting here is because I teach 104 students every term, so all 4 terms at Oregon State. And it's interesting to me how so many of my students, even the ones who are closer to my age, have no clue what happened here. And so before we get into this information, I want everyone to envision a weaving. Weavings are sacred instruments that hold millennia of knowledge based on long-lived co-evolved habitation of landscapes where my family and many other Indigenous families emerged as peoples in this landscape. We've been here since our emergence. Our emergence has stories that are long-lived and passed down through generations that talk about when we emerged and how we emerged and all of the things that go along geologically and cosmologically through our pedagogies into today's world. Some of those stories have been lost due to colonization and removals and loss of ancestral languages, but many of them are still retained today. It's why I think that due to change in our atmosphere and the warming of our planet and our earth and our mother, that scientists of the Western knowledge are starting to come to Indigenous scientists to talk with us about what we know, because we were here for many millennia before contact. And so what I'd like you to do as we're talking about these things tonight is envision that weaving, whether it's basket or mat or a piece of clothing or whatever you are having come in as a vision in your mind, of pulling the things that we're talking about out of the threads of that weaving and taking them out so that we can address these issues but remove them and give equality and support and remove the subjugation of Indigenous people from our own landscapes. The other thing I would like you to think about as we're thinking about talking about these is that I would like you to think about the fact that everyone is Indigenous from somewhere. And so if you have ancestry from Ireland, they had clans and they were Indigenous to those locations. And so I want you to think about your families and your ancestors and also all of the things that they went through as we go through this process. One of the things I want you to know off the top is that in our language, in all of our managed landscapes, and all of this earth was managed by us, there was nothing that was not untouched by Indigenous people, that in all of our many languages, there is no word for wilderness. So keep that in mind. So I'd like to start with the doctrine of discovery. I don't know how many of you might know anything about it, but we're going to start at the beginning. There were several papal bulls of discovery that were written. One of them, formerly known as the Doctrine of Discovery, which was Romanus Pontifex, which was written by Pope Nicholas V in 1455. And then there was another one, etc., that was written in 1493. Now this papal bull authorized King Alfonso of Portugal to conquer Africa and beyond. and to engage in the slave trade and discover new lands. And so I'm just going to read to you some of the wording from the doctrine. It's a very long document, but we're going to just talk about the meat and potatoes here of this. And so the doctrine says, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens who were Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. It also meant that if they don't believe in Christ, they were expendable. And it was the duty of the church to convert and educate those folks who were subdued. This doctrine was not just the framework of Portugal, it was also adopted as a framework of Spain and England. France had their hands in it as well. And it was used for the colonization of many lands, including North America. And as you know, I don't think that there is a place on earth that was never touched by this doctrine. And so where I'd like to start is between 1455 and 1493. And when we were kids, in 1492, what did we learn? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. As a young child hearing that, it was a little confusing for me. But as adults and as the people who witnessed it, as it began, it was really our best, worst day. Because our lives were turned on their heads from that time forward. When people arrived on the shores of the United States, what is now the United States, they said that it was like the Garden of Eden. The forests and the hills and the valleys and the amounts of abundance before them. They could only use that vision as what they had really thought of as what the Garden of Eden may have looked like to them. When they reached the shores, well, when Columbus reached the shores, the Tainos, they didn't expect to find people here. They thought these lands were vast and empty and were open for the taking. And the reason why they were searching is because it was a destiny, right? It was to secure lands and resources. The doctrine of discovery is really based, the colonialism of it and what turned into settler colonialism was based on having order and law over the land as human beings, that men were the only ones who could own land in many of the ancestral lineages from those times. And that they were looking to spread out also the church and to create places for the church to thrive. But what they found at time of contact in what is now the United States was approximately 165 million people. with 500 different languages and cultures. And these languages, some of them obviously were related, like Cheyenne language is Algonquian in nature. Uto-Aztecan is also part of Ute, the Shoshone people. So we had our, what I like to say is our ancestral languages that were intermingled with one another. And it was not uncommon at contact that when we were discovered that within our areas, we knew at least 13 different languages, which means we knew 13 different cultures. And we were able to work together to create trade in goods and services. One of the things that they don't like you to know is that the Creeks had a town outside of where modern day Memphis today, and it was 30 miles long. And there are approximately 140,000 people living there. As colonization occurred and early contact had been made by the Spaniards especially, diseases had wiped out many of us before the Puritans even arrived. And so when they saw what they thought was the Garden of Eden, it was actually unkept because of so much loss of life due to disease. So when the Puritans arrived, John Winthrop talked about the chosen one status, chosen as the people of God to take over the land. They familiarized themselves with the Israelites or the Canaanites when they moved and were given, I'm not Christian, so you'll have to forgive me, but when they were given the land, right? You will go there. Was it Moses and his people traveled and made it there? And they were the chosen ones, and they were given that land by God because they were good and they deserved that space. It was doctrined by God for them to have that space. And so John Winthrop felt that the tribal people didn't have any fences around their property. And it was uncultivated in a way that they had never experienced. So it was cultivated, but not in a way that they had ever experienced. And so the Puritans like to use a word called vacuum domicilium, which meant that if it's not fenced and it's not cultivated in monocrops, then they had the right to gain dominion over that land and take the lands due to the lack of development. And so under divine law, the Puritans stated that the land, that would be giving the land to English ownership. But I think right there we're going to pause because we have to cover some stuff. France and England were not happy with one another back in the 1640s. And the French priests who came down from Canada got real familiar with the Algonquin and Huron nations, and they became very familiar with them. And of course, the French were more at that time interested in creating partnerships with tribes and creating some kind of a monetary system of trade. And so they were interested in learning the language. And in the French language, the word sauvage means the people of the forest or people who live within the forest boundaries. Because that's how they recognize the people of that day. These were the Jesuits, and they were very interested in trade. And many of the people from Canada who came from France also through trade, and I mean, we're human beings, we fall in love, would take Indigenous wives. And so this is where the Métis comes from up there. But we were called Sauvage because our governments were open and free, and we were kind, and we believed in helping one another. And I'm trying to remember the Jesuit's name, but he stated that they would openly orate and they would have government meetings in designated locations. And he remarked in his writings that this must be what it was like to hear the Greeks when they orated in their government squares, because it was so divine and so well done. And they were also quite surprised that there was casualty to not having clothes on. There was no guilt or shame by exposing your body, because that was just how they were. And then England coming in, for a while, like I said, France and England did not get along, but they eventually formed a partnership. And the word sauvage became the word savage. And that changing of the word allowed Indigenous people to be subjugated because they were heathens and they had their own religious beliefs, and they did not want to become Catholic or whichever breakaway religion from coming from Europe they were being exposed to at the time. So England took the word sauvage and turned it into savage, and then created heathen. They also outlined during that time of using that word that people were not human. Indigenous people were not human. Therefore, if they're inhuman and they're not intelligent, then they have no holdings to land and they're not able to claim their lands. And so it's an important thing to talk about, because the word savage has carried forward even in today's world. And the ability to treat Indigenous people with disrespect. A couple of years ago, part of my family was up at Standing Rock, and they were arresting us and putting us in dog cages. And we were on our own land. And they were firing at us with water cannons in 3-degree weather. And we were unarmed. And we were called savages. So the reason why we stopped and added this little piece in is because as history developed during colonization, that word began to be carried forward. And that word was taken back to England and back to France. And during that time, after the 1640s in Europe, they were starting to combine languages and use languages so that they had common language as well, and inserting different words from different languages up in Europe to create common language. And England and France, then as they corrupted in Europe, became more and more encouraged to take Indigenous lands. So England then developed colonies, the colonies of Maryland and Virginia. And during that time, after Bacon's Rebellion, they leveraged that insecurity of the people then and created a white race. And that is where the word white comes from in this country. It's really not a race, but it was created that way in the colonies of England, that England created in the colonies of Maryland and Virginia. And this is before we gained, dominion over the United States. And one of the things that they did was they gave white men the ability to own all lands and to vote. And they had certain amounts of things that they owned. Their wives were under their care. So they basically owned their wives. And their wives had no ownership over their children. So if anything happened to their families at that time, the women were cast out and the men kept the children with them. White women had more, so what basically started happening is a caste system or a system of hierarchy in this what we have now as the United States. And white women were really told they were not allowed to marry anyone but white men. But we also at that time had huge trade through Powhatan and indigenous trade with tobacco, sugarcane, and those kinds of things. And it was a huge trade system. And we also had people who were Black who were not slaves at that time. And so they had land holdings actually in parts of Europe. Parts of New England, what we call New England today, and down the coast. But then they decided that they were no longer allowed to have guns, and they put sanctions on them. Now, there were people who came over as chattel slavery and during the slave trade of African people. And those folks came willingly, but they usually were branded and they had to work off their, the cost of them taking the trip over to America. And they had some ability to own things, but until that was paid off, they did not. Now, if a white woman married a Black slave or had a child with a Black slave, she was destined to be a slave for life on that plantation and would not be able to leave even if her husband died. All of her children would then be free chattel for the slave owner to use that as free labor for the rest of their lives. They were never able to leave. The same with Black slaves that came over who were taken from Africa and brought over to the slave trade. Indigenous people during that time were not really appreciated because they were pretty egalitarian. They tried to take some of us as slaves and keep us in the country, but we knew the country so well that we kept running away and they couldn't find us. And so what they did was they would take smaller tribes in the Southeast and take us to the Sugar Isles and enslave us there. Some of the tribes, and they would take man, woman, and child. They would take the whole colony and move them. And some of the people were even taken over to Europe and were there and were servants to people in England, France, Spain. So it was quite an interesting time. So there's a little bit of that history that we usually don't talk about that developed. And that is why we have that division between white and other people still today in this country, which is really, really sad because really the white does not really exist. It's a manifest of someone's ideology of how to create hierarchy and privilege. And unfortunately, the privileges haven't gone away either. Women are still held down. People of color are still held down and underrepresented. And we also have to think about what we call our forefathers who created the Declaration and started the new country, because they were living in that for about 100 years before that even started. And so that was something that was not unusual to them. And of course, they wouldn't think about the fact that maybe that wasn't the appropriate way to proceed. So now I want to skip ahead, and I want to talk about the General Crimes Act of 1817. And we could talk about the formulation of the American government and stuff. A lot of us know about that. I don't think a lot of people know that they met with the Iroquois Confederacy. I lost my view here. The Iroquois Confederacy to help draft the new laws for this country. But it's another story for another time, as one of my elders would say. So we're going to switch now to the General Crimes Act of 1817, which is actually the Marshall Trilogy. So we're a young country, growing. We've had presidents, we've had all kinds of skirmishes in the United States. We have all kinds of things going on with trade and business and ownership. And the Marshall Trilogy was an act that was taken on by the Supreme Court. And it was basically 3 lawsuits that were combined. And those lawsuits were about land and the Cherokee Nation. And, you know, there was a time when there were Cherokee people who were sitting in Congress back then, before Jackson was president. And so what the General Crimes Act allowed in the Marshall Trilogy was that tribes were deposed of ownership of their lands due to discovery. So they went back to some of the savage ability. Marshall pulled out the information. He was able to convince the court that due to the pretense of a rule that gave a decision between Christian people and heathens and savages, it allowed the United States to colonize an entire continent. So what happened was because you weren't Christian and because of manifest destiny, because of settler colonialism is beginning, because now they've decided they can take over the entire country and move and use all of the resources and create ways of being spreading across the land. And of course, you know, England was early on the West Coast as well. And then Spain came in on the West Coast. And then we had all kinds of things happen. So the Marshall Trilogy was, they used the word savage, they used the word inhuman, they used the word unintelligent in order to completely subjugate Indigenous people from having any say over their lands or their landscapes. And what that did was it created legally in Indian law, within the Constitution and also within the Indian Bill of Rights, because there is a separate Bill of Rights for Indigenous people, that they would become wards of the state. And becoming wards of the state then took away any of our abilities to make decisions for ourselves because we weren't considered intelligent enough to do that. The Supreme Court accepted the rule. They accepted the rule and made it law. And then by 1823, the Indian removals began. And we were beginning to be held as prisoners of war, removed from our homes. So this is where I'm reliving history right now. During Andrew Jackson's rule, people came into the homes of Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws and removed them in the middle of the night with anything they could carry on their backs. They were held at forts on the East Coast, and then they were marched in the height of winter to Oklahoma, what they called Oklahoma Territory. And they deposited them on top of the Osage people who were not very happy about that. So they also were still sending tribes to the Sugar Isles at that time. So this is where we're going to end our discussion, because from here, I think everybody is kind of aware of what started from there. First, it was removals, then it was boarding schools, and then it was removal of language, removal of traditional foods, removal of any of our ways of knowing, and the complete indoctrination of things to make us more human and more acceptable in the new world. And so with that, I'll open it to questions.
Thank you so much, Gail.
Sure.
That's incredibly enlightening and horribly
Incredibly enlightening.
horribly horrifying. I really especially appreciate you explaining language about the savage to heathen. I think that's a really important and critical distinction. I also, just for the rest of us, lest we think that's ancient history, I really want to say, Gail, that I think it's really important that this is not, that we really understand that this isn't ancient history.
No.
And that when we think about what's happening with the Indian Child Welfare Act and making it legal to once again remove Native children from their families and give them to white people, what happens with missing and murdered Indigenous women today, it's important. And even in my own family, my great-great-grandmother, Ta Baba Watts, was killed by the Mormon pioneers, and my great-grandmother was sold into slavery, and at the age of 8 to a polygamous family. And that this is not ancient history. It is the history of our ancestors. And I say that because and if anyone has questions or thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and I will call on you. I say that because I think it's really important for us to remember that these things impact us, which is why understanding them is so important. And I was just chatting with Simon the other day about the fact that George Washington was an Episcopal. So the way our church runs is based on the democracy that you talked about with the Iroquois, ironically enough.
Iroquois?
Because we run our churches run modeled after the democracy of the United States. And so I really think there's so many intersections here that are so important. And so I also really love what you said about the land and it not being wilderness, that there's no indigenous word for the word wilderness. Because ironically, we're in the time of Lent where we are off in the wilderness and we are searching. We're searching for 40 days. So I think that's also really beautiful and really profoundly impactful for this time in particular. But if anyone wants to raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you and open it up for questions, or if you have any thoughts, I'd love to share them with Gail. We still have 30 minutes. So by all means, let's have a conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to throw in there too that during the Marshall Trilogy, Indigenous tribes no longer were able to adjudicate for crimes.
Yeah.
And so then law enforcement became really strange on Indian lands, right? So tribes could, they could hold court for simple crime, but they could not investigate rape, murder, and that's still today. So that's when the FBI was formed. was to ensure that Indigenous people, because we are covered under federal guidelines. And still in today's world, in most of the United States, I know that there's been some change in the last 15 years, because I was in law enforcement for 25, that some local principalities are now, local groups, county sheriffs and tribal police and city law enforcement are now the laws are being passed to allow them to be sworn, so that tribal policemen can pull over a non-Native person on their reservation for alcoholism or murder or anything, and they can arrest them. Before, they used to have to hold them and hope that they stayed there until the county marshal came to take them away. And those folks knew. And, we have closed reservations and open reservations. And open reservations, non-Native people can buy houses and live there under affidavit of knowing that they live on tribal land. And on closed reservations, non-Indigenous people cannot buy homes. Those homes are all owned by the people in the community. So there's those little fine details about, and then when these oil barons, when they found oil in Oklahoma and started marrying Osage women, and most of them were Waters, their last names were Waters. And my kids, through their dad, are related to Waters. And then all of these things were happening where they were taking. Yeah. And so then the federal government had to swear out people who would help protect people for murder and kidnapping and those kinds of things. But the problem is, even today, that if someone's raped or someone is murdered on Indian reservations in the United States, especially ones that are considered out, it may take the FBI 6 months to get there. With rapes, they don't even do rape kits. And so things need to change in Indian country, because we have missing. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it was very in our faces this last year with the untimely and unfortunate death of Gabby Petito. Yeah. And the differences in how they treated her disappearance compared to Indigenous women's disappearances. And so, see, we have a long way to go. Yeah. And that's why we need to have these conversations, because people in general are kind and loving and caring, and they care about each other. Yeah. And would do anything for each other. And so this is where breaking down those bonds, we talk about it as breaking down the bonds of colonialism. We're still dealing with that in today's world. Yeah. Yeah. Our children, because of ICLA, when we were able to make strides, children were no longer being sold undocumented to non-Native families for $10 a piece. And children were no longer being removed from their cultural backgrounds and no longer relegated to institutional issues where they were no longer able to know about their knowledge, their culture, their languages. And last year, just as a statistic, Cherokee Nation lost 22 language speakers. And in some reservations or some communities, I should say communities, because not all of us were enrolled by the federal government during DAWS. And DAWS was actually designed to remove us from our land that we were now on, that we removed from our other land. And because they weren't enrolled is because they didn't have any resources. So why enroll them if we can't profit from it?
I think this is the where the truth and reconciliation comes in.
Right.
Because understanding the complexity of the policies under which religious folks, governments, law enforcement, like under which all of these policies and the complication of all of them, and the reason that they are here is to, you know, if you look at the doctrine of discovery and you look at manifest destiny and you look at the documentation of the establishment of law, the purpose of the doctrine is to eliminate everybody on wherever the settler colonialists are going. So you go, you discover something, right? You make a discovery, and then you eliminate everybody there. So the enrollment, I think, is really important. And I think we're going to actually talk about this a little bit next week too, when we've got our representative from the Siletz tribe is going to be here to talk to us about this area in particular. But I think it's really important for everyone here to understand, for example, with enrollment, the purpose of blood quantum in enrollment is to make sure that nobody can enroll. So as a great example, again, in my own experience, and Gail, you know this is something that I have struggled with really hard, is that
we all struggle with it.
We all struggle with it, right? But my grandmother had all the documentation to enroll, but one of the rules was she had to live on the reservation for the Shivwit clan. And that reservation was in middle of nowhere, Utah, with no resources, of course, right? Nothing to be gained. And she had a beautiful piece of land up in Gooding, Idaho. And so she could not be forced back to the site of her trauma. And so she couldn't live there. And so she couldn't enroll. And that has impacted all of us generationally, permanently, right? And so, so thank you. So I also think it's important for people who are here to get that this is still now. And the truth part is acknowledging that we don't know all that we don't know. And that's why I put the books and that link to exploring the doctrine of discovery in the chat. And I'll put it up again before we leave. But I think it's so important for us to see and learn about what we don't understand. Right. Because it permeates the fiber of everything.
Yeah, it's I tell my students, you know, I have students from the age of 19 all the way up to the age of 75 sometimes. I love it. And part of the whole class is built around Indigenous teaching and learning basis and worldview. So my students are brought into an Indigenous worldview, and it's very difficult for them at first to kind of wrap their head around all of that. And then they're also told, and this is true, and we need to live by these standards. There is no room for guilt. There is no room for fear. There's room for care. There's room for consideration. There's room for learning openly. You may have resistance, but unfortunately, you only have resistance because it's uncomfortable. And so I don't want you to be uncomfortable, because I want everyone in my classroom to feel safe. Yeah. To discuss these really, really difficult things. But the thing is until we know how this all started, like we just discussed tonight, we really don't know how to deal with what's going on today. Yeah. Because it was all based on resources. Yeah. And even some of my students will say, well, they obviously didn't know that they were doing that. No, they did know they were doing that. They did. And when you have to say that in a good way and try to comfort them at the same time, you know, I feel like the grandma and the auntie and the mom to like 104 people, and sometimes the daughter. So, you know, it's how you then try to enforce that, you know, well, this is how we are, and this is how we discuss, and this is how we work through government, and this is what we do. Because when we teach, we're teachers. We love everybody. And not everyone is easy, you know, and they get slammed pretty hard because they get all the visual stuff in my class. It's a multi-dimensional learning system where they have visual things, and they have readings, and they have all kinds of things, activities that they have to do. And so, you know, coming together in these conversations are really, really important, because this is how we all know that we are human being people, and we all are puny human beings. And we all have things we have to work through, and that we have to work together to come to common good knowledge. Yeah. That there should not be these hierarchies, and there should not be these prejudices, and there should not be these ideologies of unintelligence and inhumaneness, and that we are all basically human beings, and we're all indigenous to some location.
It's really helpful. Jacqueline, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I just want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to have some of this Indigenous background shared with me and the rest of us. It's so important for us to understand what the foundation of our country was like. And what occurs to me is there's a man by the name of Thomas Hubble who talks about, he's German, I believe, who talks about generational trauma. And until we look at the generational trauma, we're destined to continue repeating it. Which is what we're doing. And what comes to mind is, I know Canada and South Africa have done that truth and reconciliation. And I'm wondering how Canada brought themselves to the point of being willing to do that, and what that process entailed. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Well, I think that the coming of Trudeau, isn't Trudeau the president of the country at this time, or the prime minister? He's not the president. He in the beginning took on a conscious effort to make change, and the First Nations and their oh my goodness, they're called reserves, I think. They put their foot down, and they said, you are going to recognize this. And there were people who were willing to move forward with it. They had to vote out quite a few people out of their, was it parliamentary ideology that they have? But you'll have to forgive me for being so ignorant about Canada. I just,
well,
but, you know,
I'm ignorant about the United States. So.
I think your point, Gail, is that the First Nations people fought like hell.
Yeah,
they had to fight.
Yeah, and there is kind of a different ideology in Canada as compared to here. Yeah, there really is. There is a huge resistance here to acknowledge anything that is Indigenous, unless they want, you know, appropriation. But it's, but you know, we thought with the Standing Rock that we were finally getting somewhere, and I think we did. And we had farmers and ranchers joining us alongside of us. But then we have this resistance between governments, state government, federal government, and all of this that goes on, you know.
And just so you know, at an Episcopal, at a diocese level here in Oregon, we have the Racial Justice Working Group, and also the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group. And they're going to be folks from the Truth and Reconciliation Group coming to talk to us in a couple of weeks. So, and to talk about their experiences wrestling with truth and reconciliation. And so from the Episcopal perspective. So I think that also will be a really great discussion. Yes, Simon.
Thank you. This is just brilliant. It's just wonderful that we're even talking about this now, because, not that many years ago, this kind of conversation, I'm not sure would have been possible. So that is, I'm just so pleased about that. And Gail, you were saying about the sharing of stories, mm-hmm. and how we shouldn't be afraid to do that. And, I think well, I can only speak for myself, but, I'm literally a first generation immigrant. And, I've had some uncomfortable feelings about the whole story of European relationship with Native peoples in North America. And it's left me sort of not really sure really what to feel or how to frame it. Well, interestingly, so as I started recently, actually at Missy's suggestion and with her help, I've been doing some research actually about my own ancestors in the Midlands of England. And it is so fascinating that starting in the Tudor period, very similar things happened to my ancestors that seemed to have happened to people here. And I'm like, oh my goodness, because my people, I was saying to Missy just before we all started, what I discovered was in the Tudor period, that's when the legal service really started to get off the whole bureaucracy was started to be set up. And it's so fascinating because my ancestors were able to have use of what they call common land, right? To graze their animals, to grow crops, whatever. And gradually, the people with access to the courts were able to designate land as waste. All of a sudden, common land became wasteland. Mm-hmm. And if a piece of land was designated waste, then it could be fenced around and given in ownership to one individual. And this is what happened. And it was a 300-year process that ended in the early 1800s. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the same story, but in a different place. Mm-hmm. And so that really so then I became less afraid of your stories, because I'm like, oh, well, it seems that my people have a similar story. How interesting.
What I think is interesting is, that a lot of people from Europe and other regions they were subjected to so much through monarchy and taking of, like you said, the common lands. They couldn't even hunt. And then when they weren't paying enough taxes, they would burn their grain fields. So thank God for potatoes, right? And we all know potatoes came from here, Every year, a group of people from Ireland come and walk the Trail of Tears with the Choctaw Nation. Oh. And there is a monument to the Choctaw people in Ireland. I think it's in Cork.
Yep.
I would really like to see it.
Yep.
But everyone suffered the same similar issues that happened here. And it was it's so interesting to me that when everyone finally were able to escape, because, it wasn't uncommon for us to bring people in, we've been totally mixed from forever. The blood quantum thing is a really big deal. You're going to hear about it. But, and the federal government forces on us that we are not allowed to recognize our other parts of us. So, but in the day, like in my Apache side, if you were Bud and Kohi Apache and you married, and we were matrilineal, we were not patrilineal, most of it. And there's a few patrilineal groups, but not many. And when you married the woman, you went to her, you were now part of that family. And you were no longer like Geronimo or Goyate, as he was called. He was Ben Kohi. He married into Chiricahua and he became a Chiricahua. That's how he became a Chiricahua. And he married Cochise's daughter, So he, and he was never a chief. He was a holy man. And his sister, she had special gifts as well. But I mean, that's how we were. That's how we rolled. You know, that's why we have what they called freedmen or Black Indian societies. They knew French. We fell in love. You know, it's like I said with the French, we fell in love. We became Métis, you know, but that's how it was. And it wasn't until Dawes when, well, there were a few other roles. There was Baker role, Guinan role. There were a couple other roles before, but they were no longer recognized by the federal government. And so when the Dawes happened, which I'm sure you'll hear more about because the Dawes really affects everybody. You were, you know, lined up at tables full of congressmen and people from Washington who sat there and looked at you and decided by the way you looked, you were 1/2, 1/4, 1/3 full blood. And then you were either this or that. And if they ran out of numbers for the day for, you know, if a brother and sister, like the Tiger family, if the brother and sister were standing next to each other, he was enrolled as a Creek and she was enrolled as a Cherokee.
Wow.
And so there's this whole convoluted mess. And then in Oklahoma, because of the way Dawes was set up, and it's kind of that way throughout, that if you had children, which you will, then you couldn't get any more land. You had to divide what you had. And so like, I know people like Robert Longcrane, who's Ho-Chunk and Rosebud, he has this square of land that he can stand on. That is still part of his family land. And you know, the thing is this is not how it works, but this is what happened. And so I'm sure you're going to hear more about that. I mean, like I said, we can have a conversation from now until next time this year, right? So
I think what you're talking about too, Gail, that's really important is the acknowledgement that these are sovereign nations. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
We're legitimately sovereign nations.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
when the Episcopals came to Oregon,
mm-hmm.
the amount of sovereign nations that they interacted with all along that trail,
right,
was in the multitudes. And one of the conversations that I was recently having with Lahui Whitebear, who is also Oregon State University, is we were talking about how when you look at cowboy movies, for example, we were watching Yellowstone in 1883. Which is a whole
yeah, you girls.
I know, we're so into it. But the vision is of the you know, the pioneers were seeing this empty land.
Yeah.
Right? So when you think of the cowboy movies, right, it's all empty, but it was full until the disease destroyed all the people, killed all the people. Mm-hmm. And so that's also a really interesting point of history that's relative to this truth and reconciliation, to just acknowledge the truth of the histories of Indigenous people and reconcile it without feeling guilty for how we are born. I was at a religious conference called Evolving Faith. And at that conference, they were talking about racial justice and Jesus. And one of the things they talked about was this white woman said, I just feel so guilty. And this beautiful panel, all of them said, we don't want your white guilt. You didn't choose how you were born.
No.
We want you to do something about it now. You didn't choose this. We want you to do something about it now. And it was so profound for all of the people whose ancestral descent was from Europe, right? Like they felt bad, just like Simon is really wrestled. I mean, Simon and I talked about it. But I think that this is really an important thing, right? One of the things, one of my very good friends is we all carry the oppressed and the oppressor within us.
Right.
All of us do. And how do we move from ancestral trauma to survival and thriving? Not just stick into survival, but really move into thriving. Because I like to say that my great grandmothers on both sides of my family, they didn't just survive. They survived so I could thrive.
Right.
And that's the best revenge, honestly.
Exactly. And we also in Indian country like to say, my granddaughter is carrying my great-great-granddaughter within her.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So we have to think, right? We have to think forward to the generations that are coming, because they are living with us at this time. They are just not animate. And so we have to figure out ways, and that's all children. That doesn't just mean Indigenous children. We have to make sure that they are cared for. And right now, you know, we're all going through a lot right now. We've been through COVID, you know, and some of us who are older, like I'm 65, we've already been through a bunch of stuff, you know, and some of us have been even through more than that. And now we have this thing with the Ukraine that nobody even understands. We kind of understand, we kind of know what's going on, but it's like, when do we move? When do we take care of this business instead of sitting here every day watching people die on our television sets? So we have to think about those generations, all of them. And we are like the grandmothers and the grandfathers. We're the elders, right? We are elders, or we're becoming elders, or we're baby elders. And we, you know, and this is where the oral traditions come from, and the moving forward of knowledge, you know, that, wow, we've told these stories. We've told these stories about these things that happen, and look, they're still going on, and they shouldn't be. You know, and we have to protect each other, and we have to protect our resources, and we have to help each other.
Jacqueline, do you have another question?
Yes. Yes. I just wanted to share, I first started to have my consciousness raised when I lived a long time ago in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Oh, Carlisle Indian School.
Yeah. And I remember walking through the cemetery and seeing all the graves of the young children. And what's so interesting is that cemetery is now on the grounds of the War College.
Yeah. It was an Army barracks when they moved us all in there to take us and teach us how to be what they wanted us to be.
Yeah. And then from there, I moved in Wisconsin near the Menominee Indian Reservation. And when I don't know, wasn't sure if it happened when I was there, but I know they were the first, I don't know if tribe is the right word to use, but they were recognized by the federal government. And then when I moved to Oregon, I heard that Siletz was the second. What does it mean to be recognized by the federal government? How does that change your status?
Okay, it changes your status a lot, because the federal government swore when they moved us around and took our land away and then put us on these spaces. Some of them were our ancestral spaces, some were not. And because they swore certain things. They swore they would make sure we had food, which actually was commodities, which was not food. Our water was poisoned by alcohol because it was rancid water. They had to teach us and give us an education. That's where you hear about the Indian Ed programs. Those are acts that are sworn by the federal government. And they had to do certain things under the Indigenous Bill of Rights. And so, but early on with the boarding school thing, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know, is Buddy gonna talk about the boarding schools?
I think so.
Yeah, see, my grandfather went to Chilocco Indian School, and some of my family, which is just over the Oklahoma border into Kansas, it's kind of on the border of Kansas and Oklahoma. Some of my family were at Carlisle.
Wow.
And I have paperwork for one of my cousins, Thomas, and there's paperwork written back and forth that says, well, he said he was going back to New Mexico. The Indian agent said he's not here. Well, we don't know what happened to him. Well, why do you not know what happened to him? well, he said he was ill, blah, blah, blah. Well, he was in one of those graves outside the camp, outside the gates. And, you know, so we also have that problem of all these children who are abused and sterilized, raped, beaten, starved. I think Canada now is, they've still got 128 schools to do LIDAR work on, and they've found 11,000 unmarked graves. We haven't even really addressed that here at Chamawa. We had a young woman from the Crow Nation, her name was Small, doing master's research in the wetlands at Chamawa and found graves. And they still haven't like addressed that, or have they even gone in with equipment and really identified how many are there. And so, you know, I mean, there were atrocities. There were things that are unspeakable, like, you know.
And Gail, I think it's important because it was done in two ways, in the name of God.
Right, it was all done in the name of God. Yeah. It
was done in the name of God. And it was very willful and intentional. And so and we have not addressed it. I cannot underscore for all of us how important it is that Deb Haaland is the Secretary of the Interior.
Oh yeah.
There has never been an Indigenous person as the Secretary of Interior ever.
Yeah.
And so I also like send her prayers and all the good things.
Yeah.
Because we cannot underscore, because of that federal recognition. So there are still tribes that don't have federal recognition, so they cannot receive benefits of other tribes, and other tribes that still live under blood quantum, they're losing their people. And so they're also not getting the federal benefits of enrollment. And so it's a very complicated, convoluted issue. It's so multi-layered that, I mean, it's like you said, Gail, this is like years of conversation. But what our hope is, what my hope is that it starts the conversations and the questioning within you, so that you can come to the people who are going to be presenting here, or to me, or to Father Simon, and say, I want more information. You know, how do you think I could get more information? And I actually added 2 other books into so I reposted some recommended text, and then that clicked to the Bexley Seabury Exploration of the Doctrine of Discovery, which if you scroll all the way down that page, you'll notice the fall cohort starting in the fall. It's 5 weeks. It's so amazing. But I added 2 other books called The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus and Ladder to the Light, which are written by a man named Stephen Charleston, who is an Episcopal, I think he's a rector.
He's a bishop. He was Bishop of Alaska and then Bishop of Northwest Territories.
Yeah, and he's written to the 4 Vision Quests of Jesus is so beautiful. It's native and indigenous teachings applied to the Bible, and it is like one of the most beautiful things I've ever read in my life.
Yeah,
he's so lovely. And such a wonderful connector to truth and reconciliation in really beautiful and ways. And so we have a couple minutes left, and I don't know if anybody else has any comments or questions or thoughts that you want to add before we wrap up in prayer. If anybody, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. But if you have anything you want to ask or add to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm open to have more conversations.
That would be great, Gail.
And it would be fun in person.
It would be fun in person. We can meet at the church.
Yeah, it would be fun in person, because then we could do what we're supposed to do. Have food, talk.
Eat. Important. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Gail, what is the name of the course you teach?
The course I teach is, the course I teach, the name is not, institutional, I don't know. But the name of the course is Ag 301, 400 and Ag 301. And it is called Ecosystem Sciences of Pacific Northwest Indians. I also helped write, I wrote that curriculum. I also wrote the curriculum with a team of people for the Ag 311 class, which was Indigenous Agriculture, which is supposed to turn into every week of that class, all 10 weeks is supposed to turn into a quarter of a whole term class. There's so much that you could learn and do actual farming and planting and doing those studies and things like that, and polycultures. Don't get me started. And then I used to also teach a class called Fisheries and Wildlife 340, which was multicultural. I don't know if they've changed the name, but it was called Multicultural Perspectives of in Ecosystem Sciences or something like that. And I haven't taught it for a few years, but I've taught all three of those classes, and I've been teaching since 2008. So I was in my master's when I started teaching. And, you know, but I also have a long background in you know, I was in law enforcement for 25 years. And then I was involved in Indian Ed programs and Indian education programs as a volunteer for 40 years.
So the course you're currently teaching, that's ecosystem science, what?
Pacific Northwest Indians.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And all of the classes that I teach are called backcourt classes, and they are difference, power, and discrimination, or cultural awareness classes. And so they're not easy. They're not easy.
Backcourt?
Yeah, they have to take one of these classes in order to get their degree.
Oh,
yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic.
They don't think so.
There's times.
Good for their souls.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's hard. The first 3 weeks are killer, and then they, and then they start. The lights start coming on. Yeah.
Well, I think I sort of wonder whether part of it is, you know, for such a long time, many of us have been taught to be afraid of other people, you know, and but actually we have so much to learn from each other. I mean, I'm sort of wondering if we're in a moment of time, given our history and where we are now, and maybe because of COVID and other things, that we're rediscovering our imagination. You know, I think for such a long time we were told, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's always been, and this is the best we can do. And that turns out not to be true at all, that human beings can organize themselves in lots of different ways.
Right.
We don't have to be stuck. Yes, we've inherited this history from our ancestors, but we can choose completely different paths now.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think to me, that's the hope.
Yeah, and in my classes too, they learn traditional sciences, indigenous sciences, and Western science, and we do comparisons through the whole process, you know. Yeah, and so it's really important to decolonize me. And it's a hard job.
There's just one more comment I hope it's okay to make. I don't want to monopolize, but I used to volunteer at Hatfield Marine Science Center and listen to a lot of the lectures they taught. And I remember asking a couple of the classes, well, what's the indigenous take on this information? And there would be like 3 lectures and none of them would know. Now they know. And they're purposely, when I listen to things out of Hatfield, they're incorporating indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, we're trying to make great strides at Oregon State University, breaking down the bonds of settler colonialism, because university, they stole thousands of acres from the Kalapuya people. And thank goodness they're still with us, even though they've been confederated under two tribes, the Siletz and the Grand Ronde. And both of those tribes under Eisenhower were also terminated. And they did get their indigenous who are not even recognized by the federal government and get no services. And then if you're state recognized, unless the state gives you services, you don't get any services either. They're just acknowledging that, yeah, you're native and we recognize you, and that's about it. So there are a lot of things. I think that we used to call it healing the hurts. There's a lot of hurts to heal.
And that's a really wonderful reminder that we're going to be able to get into all of this area history. Perfect setup, Gail. We're getting all into all of the area's history next week. So I'm really
I'm excited.
I am too. I'm so excited.
He'll be able to talk about termination and restoration.
Yeah, it's going to be really good. I put my email in the chat in case anybody has any follow-up questions or you need anything else from me. And before we wrap up, I'm actually saying this prayer in honor of Gail because we have a fond love of Mother Mary together. So I would love it if you would join me in prayer for my most favorite prayer of all time ever. Mother of fair love, we look to you. Take into your hands the ribbon of our lives and see the snarl of knots that keeps us bound to fear, anxiety, and hopelessness. We beg you, Mother, by your powerful intercession and long fingers of love and grace, undo the knots in our hearts and in our lives. Free us to love as Christ loves. Mary, undoer of knots, pray for us. Amen.
Amen.
Gail, thank